This is The Quiet of the Glens, written by Beryl Coops. Quiet of the Glens is an atmospheric trial of survival in a world devoid of all the creature comforts of modern society when they are wiped out in an instant by the sun's power when it releases a CME. An astrophysicist's solo hike in the Scottish Highlands becomes a fight for survival when a solar cataclysm erases the modern world. Alone in a silent, frozen landscape, she must use science and instinct to endure, facing a haunting choice: embrace isolating safety, or risk everything to seek other survivors in the terrifying quiet of the Glens. The Quiet of the Glens. Chapter 1. The Silent Symphony. The first thing Dr. Aris Thorne noticed was the silence. Not an absence of sound, but a change in its quality. The low, ever-present hum that underpins the modern world, the one you never notice until it's gone, had vanished. Aris paused on the granite-strewn path, one hand resting on the cool, rough stone of a cairn marking the route through the Lyrig Gru Pass. She tilted her head, listening. The wind still sighed through the rust-colored heather, a ptarmigan clucked somewhere in the mist, and the distant rush of a stream filtered up from the valley floor. But the deeper silence was unnerving. It was the sound of a world unplugged. She shrugged the feeling off, attributing it to the profound isolation of the Cairngorms. At over 4,000 feet, with mountains hunched like sleeping giants against a sky the color of slate, it was easy to feel like the last person on Earth. That was, after all, why she was here. 3 weeks of solo hiking through the Scottish Highlands was her antidote to the fluorescent-lit, screen-dominated chaos of her life at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Here, there were no emails, no grant proposals, no constant pressure to interpret data from a satellite orbiting Jupiter. Here, the only data stream was the weather, and the only codes to break were the patterns of animal tracks in the mud. She checked her watch, a chunky, solar-powered Garmin with more functions than the cockpit of a 747. 4:23 that afternoon. The light was already beginning to bleed from the sky, the short October day yielding to a long, chilly evening. The digital display was crisp and clear. She tapped the barometric pressure reading. It was dropping steadily. A storm, maybe. Not unexpected. Her plan was to make it to the Corra Bothy, a few miles further into the pass. The simple, stone shelter would provide a roof, a dry floor, and a fireplace. A luxury after days in her one-woman tent. She hoisted her pack, its familiar way to comfort, and continued along the path, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. An hour later, the second anomaly occurred. Her watch beeped, a low battery warning. Frowning, she held it up to the dim light. It had been at 98% that morning. The solar charging should have been more than sufficient, even under the Scottish cloud cover. She pulled her satellite messenger from the side pocket of her pack. The screen was dead. Not a flicker. She pressed the power button repeatedly, a knot of professional curiosity tightening in her stomach. It was a rugged device, built for extremes. It shouldn't just fail. Then the sky began to sing. It started as a faint, green shimmer on the northern horizon, a curtain of light wavering gently. Aurora. She'd hoped to see it, had even planned her late autumn trip to increase her chances. She smiled, stopping to watch the celestial display. But the smile faded as the shimmer intensified into a violent, pulsating ripple. The green deepened to a toxic, brilliant emerald, then slashed with furious ribbons of magenta and violet. It wasn't gentle anymore. It was a raging, silent firestorm that raced across the entire dome of the sky, from horizon to horizon. Aris's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a normal aurora borealis. This was a superstorm. A Carrington-level event. Oh, no, she whispered, the words swallowed by the vast landscape. Her mind, trained for this very thing, began clicking through the implications with cold, terrifying efficiency. A coronal mass ejection. A billion-ton cloud of solar plasma, magnetically charged, traveling at millions of miles an hour, slamming into Earth's magnetosphere. The beautiful light show was the visual manifestation of that collision, high-energy particles exciting atoms in the upper atmosphere. But the real danger was on the ground. The fluctuating magnetic fields would induce colossal currents in any long conductor. Power grids would act like giant antennas, overloading and melting down. Transformers would explode, frying themselves beyond repair. Undersea communication cables, pipelines, railway lines, all of it would be vulnerable. Her dead devices weren't a coincidence. They were the canaries in the coal mine. The EMP-like effect of a severe geomagnetic storm would have fried the delicate circuitry of anything not hardened against it or tucked away in a perfect Faraday cage. Her watch, her phone, her GPS, the satellite messenger, all were sophisticated, fragile pieces of electronics. All were now useless. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. She forced it down. Data. She needed data. She ran through her inventory. Her headlamp was a simple LED model. Would it work? She fumbled for it, her fingers numb with more than just the cold. She clicked the switch. Nothing. She unscrewed the end cap, removed the 3 AA batteries, and reseated them. She clicked the switch again. A feeble, flickering glow emanated from the LED, dying almost instantly. The initial pulse had partially fried it, draining the batteries or damaging the circuit. Useless. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Think, Aris. Think. She was an astrophysicist alone in one of the most remote regions of the UK. She was prepared for a twisted ankle, for a sudden blizzard, for getting lost. She had a map and a compass. She had food for 5 more days. She had a good sleeping bag and a tent. But she was not prepared for the end of the world. The glorious, terrifying lights continued their silent, violent dance, illuminating the mountain peaks in an eerie, shifting glow. It was the most magnificent thing she had ever seen, and it filled her with a primal dread. The silence was no longer just the absence of man-made hum. It was the sound of everything stopping. She looked down the darkening valley, towards where the bothy lay. Shelter. That was the first priority. A stone wall between her and the coming storm, both meteorological and societal. With one last look at the screaming sky, Aris Thorne turned her back on the spectacle and began to walk, not as a tourist on a holiday, but as a survivor in a new and silent world. The first few flakes of snow began to fall, catching the hellish light as they spiraled down to earth. Chapter 2: The Calculus of Shelter. The world had shrunk to the circle of faint light cast by her flickering headlamp and the next few feet of treacherous path. The snow was falling in earnest now, thick, wet flakes that clung to her waterproofs and dusted the dark granite underfoot like icing sugar. The aurora, having spent its furious energy, had subsided into a faint, greenish smear behind the thickening cloud cover, a dying echo of the cataclysm. Every few minutes, Aris stopped to check her compass, cupping her hands around the glowing dial to protect it from the snow. The simple, magnetic instrument was now her most valuable piece of technology. It was a relic, a thing of needles and liquid, and it had, by its very primitiveness, survived the end of the age that created it. The irony was not lost on her. Her mind was a split screen. One part was the scientist, coldly analyzing the event. The CME's impact would have been near instantaneous across the hemisphere. There would be no help coming. No mountain rescue teams with their helicopters and thermal imaging. No police. No army. The cities, she shut down that line of thought. The cities would be tombs of darkness and desperate millions. Her isolation, once a choice for solitude, was now her only advantage. The other part of her mind was purely animal, focused on the immediate equation: calories, distance, shelter, cold. The calculation was grim. Her headlamp was failing, its light guttered like a dying candle. Without it, navigating the boulder field in the pitch blackness of a cloudy night would be impossible. A broken ankle out here was a death sentence now. She had to reach the bothy before the light died completely. She pushed on, her pace a careful, deliberate slog. The weight of her pack, once a familiar companion, now felt like an anchor. It was full of things that were suddenly worthless. A power bank for her dead phone. A Kindle loaded with books she could not access. Their useless weight was a mockery. But other items had just skyrocketed in value. Her waterproof matches, sealed in a plastic bag. Her small gas stove, would it even work? The igniter was electronic, but the gas itself was just gas. She could light it manually. Her water purification tablets. Her half-eaten bag of nuts and dried fruit. And her knowledge. That was the heaviest, most vital tool she carried. She knew the mechanics of the solar system that had just tried to kill her. She knew how to read a topographical map and translate its lines into the real-world agony of ascent and descent. She knew the basic physics of heat loss and insulation. She crested a small rise, and there it was. A low, rectangular shape of dark stone against the lighter grey of the snow. The Cora Bothy. No light came from its windows. No smoke from its chimney. Relief, so potent it made her knees weak as it washed over her. She was the first one here. The wooden door, bleached grey by wind and rain, was unlocked. It opened with a groan of protest. The interior was pitch black and smelled of cold ash, damp stone, and the faint, pleasant scent of old wood smoke. She stepped inside, shrugging off her pack, and used the last dregs of her headlamp's power to sweep the single room. It was as described in the guidebooks: stone walls, a stone floor, a large fireplace filled with old ash, a wooden sleeping platform along one wall. A few empty food tins and a broken candle sat on the mantelpiece. It was bleak, cold, and utterly beautiful. It was shelter. The headlamp beam stuttered and died, plunging her into an absolute blackness so complete it felt solid. She stood still for a moment, breathing in the silence, letting her eyes adjust. Slowly, faint details emerged. The faint grayer rectangle of the window. The darker outline of the fireplace. Working by touch, she found the candle on the mantel. She rummaged in her pack for her matches, her fingers stiff with cold. The scrape of the match was shockingly loud in the silence. The sudden flare of light was almost blinding. She held her breath, half expecting it to sputter out, a victim of some residual electromagnetic curse. But it burned steady, a tiny, defiant sun in the darkness. She lit the candle stump, dripping wax onto the stone mantel to secure it. The room was transformed. The flickering light pushed the shadows back, revealing the graffiti of generations of hillwalkers carved into the wood, names and dates going back decades. A history of temporary respite. Her first task was fire. The Bothy had a small store of peat bricks and kindling left by previous visitors. She said a silent thank you to the unknown benefactors and built a small teepee of twigs over a ball of paper from her notebook. Soon, a small, hesitant flame was licking at the peat. It caught slowly, burning with a dark, earthy smoke that smelled of ancient Scotland. As the heat began to radiate outward, the crushing weight of the cold began to lift, just a little. She boiled water on her stove, the manual lighting worked, and made a simple meal of rehydrated stew. The hot food was a catalyst, thawing not just her body but her frozen mind. Sitting on the wooden platform, wrapped in her sleeping bag, watching the peat fire glow, the reality of her situation settled upon her with the weight of the mountains outside. She was alone. Truly alone. The Bothy was a bubble of temporary safety in an ocean of silent chaos. Her 5 days of food would be gone in 5 days. Then what? She had a fishing line and hooks in her survival kit, but the streams would soon be frozen. She knew the principles of setting snares, but had never done it. And then there were the other variables. The Bothy was on a known trail. Others would come. The ones who made it this far would be like her, equipped, knowledgeable, and desperate. Would they be allies? Or would the rules have already changed out there in the dark? She pulled out her map and spread it on the floor by the candlelight. Her world was now contained within its laminated folds. Her eyes traced the contours of the glens, the blue threads of rivers, the tiny black squares marking other Bothys. This was her new universe. Her knowledge of the stars, once used to probe the secrets of distant galaxies, would now be used for a far more primal purpose, to not get lost on her way to the next crumbling stone shelter. The wind picked up outside, howling around the corners of the little building. The storm had arrived. But inside, for now, there was a candle, a fire, and the quiet, terrifying mathematics of survival. Chapter 3: The Inventory of the Lost. Dawn was a grudging, grey affair. The storm had blown itself out in the night, leaving behind a world hushed and smothered under a foot of fresh snow. Aris awoke stiff and cold, the fire having dwindled to a nest of grey ash. The silence was profound. No distant drone of a morning flight heading for Inverness. No faint hum from a far-off generator. It was a blanket of quiet, heavy and complete. Her first action was to rebuild the fire, her movements slow and deliberate in the cold. The simple process, gathering the last of the stored peat, arranging kindling, striking a match, felt like a ritual, an affirmation of continued existence. As the new flames took hold, she set a pot of snow to melt for water. The mundane task anchored her. Then, with the clinical detachment of a scientist conducting an experiment, she began her inventory. She emptied her pack completely, laying each item on the wooden sleeping platform in the dim light filtering through the single window. This was her new baseline. This was the sum total of her civilization. The results were a ledger of loss and luck. The useless phone, a sleek, black rectangle of obsidian. A paperweight. Satellite messenger, equally dead. Its SOS button, a symbol of ultimate salvation, was now just a plastic nipple. Headlamp, defunct. Power bank, useless. Digital camera, a fancy brick. Smartwatch, blank screen. The hiking GPS, this one stung. It was a high-end, rugged model. She pressed the power button one more time, a futile gesture. Nothing. It was a total loss. The useful map and compass, priceless. She placed them to one side with reverence. Waterproof matches and lighter, critical. Small gas stove and 2 full canisters, several weeks of ability to heat water and cook. Multi-tool, knife, pliers, screwdrivers. Invaluable. First aid kit, a treasure trove. Water purification tablets, essential. Fishing line and hooks, potential. 50 feet of paracord, infinitely useful. Notebook and pencils, for recording, planning, even Tinder. Headscarf, beanie, gloves, spare thermal layers, survival. The provisional. Her tent, shelter, but a cold and exposed one compared to a bothy. Its metal poles were fine, no long conductors to have attracted an induced current. Her sleeping bag, a lifesaver. Rated to -10 degrees Celsius. It would need to be. Food, 5 days of dehydrated meals, 2 days of nuts, chocolate, and oat bars. The math was simple and alarming. She had a week, at a reduced caloric intake, before she was on emergency rations. The most important item wasn't in her pack. It was in her head. Knowledge. She tore a page from her notebook and began a list, the pencil scratched loud in the silence. 1. Water, melt snow. Boil filter tablet all water. No exceptions. 2. Shelter, bothies are priority. Map the network. Identify fallbacks. 3. Food, rations immediately. 1,500 calories day. Scout for fishing opportunities. Research edible plants. Knowledge gap. 4. Fire, conserve matches. Learn to use a fire steel with the knife. Practice needed. 5. Security, this one gave her pause. She wrote it down anyway. The bothy door had no lock. She propped her trekking pole against it last night. A pathetic alarm system. Aris prepared a small breakfast, a single oat bar and a cup of hot water and studied the map. She was here, at Cora. The next bothy was a day's hike west, deeper into the mountains. South, the path eventually led toward Braemar, a town. The word town now felt threatening. A concentration of people with vanishing resources. A petri dish for desperation. North was more wilderness. Fewer people, but even fewer resources and harsher weather. Her gaze kept drifting south, down the length of the Lyrig Grew. Not towards Braemar, but to a smaller side glen called Glen D. On the map, it was just a bunch of contour lines and the thin blue thread of a river. But it was more secluded. It felt safer. A sound shattered her concentration. It was a faint, rhythmic crunching. The sound of footsteps in snow. Aris froze, her hand closing around the shaft of her trekking pole. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The sound was coming from outside, along the path she'd used last night. She crept to the window, keeping to the side, and peered out. A figure was approaching, moving slowly, head down against the glare of the snow. A man. He was dressed in hiking gear, a large pack on his back. He looked exhausted, his steps dragging. As he drew closer, she could see the tense set of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned ahead. He hadn't seen her yet. This was the variable. The unknown in her survival equation. Her first instinct, the primal one, was to stay hidden. To let him pass. The safety of isolation. But another part, the part that remembered being human in a society, recoiled at the idea. What if he was hurt? What if he had information? What if he was just another terrified person, like her? He was 50 feet away now. He looked up, and his eyes locked directly on the bothy. He stopped walking. He'd seen the thin wisp of smoke from her chimney. He stood there for a long moment, as still as she was, both of them assessing the other across the white silence. Then, slowly, he raised a hand in a tentative, non-threatening greeting. The calculation was no longer about resources and routes. It was about trust. And Aris had no data to work with. The only thing she knew for certain was that she was no longer alone. The quiet of the Glens had been broken. Chapter 4. The First Variable. The man stood frozen, his raised hand a question mark against the vast white backdrop. Aris remained at the window, hidden in the shadows of the bothy, her mind racing through scenarios with the cold, swift logic of a machine passing code. Scenario A. Friendly. A fellow hiker seeking shelter. Potential for alliance, shared resources, shared knowledge. Scenario B. Hostile. Desperate, dangerous. A threat to her food, her safety, her life. Probability. Unknown. Insufficient data. The man lowered his hand. He took a slow, careful step forward, then another, his eyes fixed on the bothy door. He moved like someone who expected the ground to give way at any moment. His face was pale beneath a scruff of ginger beard, etched with a fatigue that went deeper than a single night out in a storm. Aris made her decision. Secrecy was no longer an option. He knew someone was here. Hiding now would only breed suspicion and fear. Fear made people unpredictable. She had to control the variable. She unblocked the door and opened it just enough to step into the frame, her trekking pole held loosely but visibly in one hand. The cold air bit at her face. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding strangely loud and small in the immense quiet. The man flinched, startled, and stopped his advance. He looked at her, and she saw the same calculation going on behind his eyes. His gaze flicked from her face to the trekking pole and back again. "Hello," he replied. His voice was hoarse, with a distinct Scottish accent. "Saw the smoke. Didn't he expect to find anyone?" "I didn't expect to be found," Aris said, keeping her tone neutral. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" He shook his head, a quick, jerky motion. "No hurt. Just lost. Everything's gone. My phone. My GPS. Everything's dead." The words tumbled out, laced with a rising panic he was trying hard to suppress. Aris nodded slowly. "I know. Mine too." It was a geomagnetic storm. A CME. He stared at her blankly. The acronym meant nothing to him. To him, it was just a thing that happened, a supernatural event that broke his world. A solar flare, she simplified. It fries electronics. It's not coming back on. The confirmation seemed to drain the last of the hope from him. His shoulders slumped. "Oh, God. Where are you headed?" Aris asked. "Aviemore," he said, gesturing vaguely northeast. "I was on a 2-day loop. Came from Whitewell. I thought if I could just get to the town." His voice trailed off as he realized the futility. Aviemore would be just as dark, just as chaotic, and a lot more dangerous. "You're a long way from Aviemore," Aris said, consulting the map in her mind. "And the lyrig grew in this weather with no kit." She left the sentence hanging. It was a death sentence. He swallowed hard. "The bothy. Is there room?" This was the moment. Invite him in, and she introduced an unknown into her controlled experiment. Turn him away, And she condemned him. She looked past him, down the empty, snow-filled pass. There was no one else. He was just one man. Cold, scared, and alone. The human instinct won out, narrowly, over the paranoid survivor. "There's room," she said, stepping back from the doorway. "There's a fire." The gratitude that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to see. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Ewan, by the way. Ewan MacLeod." "Aris Thorne," she said, moving aside to let him in. Ewan shuffled into the bothy, his eyes widening at the glorious warmth of the peat fire. He shrugged off his massive pack with a groan of relief and all but collapsed onto the wooden platform next to it, rubbing his hands together before holding them out to the flames. Aris busied herself with melting more snow, her senses on high alert. She watched him from the corner of her eye as she worked. His gear was good quality but brand new, the bright colors not yet faded from regular use. A weekend warrior, not a seasoned hillwalker. His pack was huge, stuffed to the point of bursting, likely with inefficiently packed, heavy gear. "So, a solar flare?" he asked after a few minutes of silence, his voice steadier now. "Is that what the lights were?" "That was the effect of it," Aris said, handing him a cup of hot water. "The cause was a coronal mass ejection. A huge cloud of magnetized plasma from the sun. It hit our atmosphere and, well, you saw the show." "A show," he repeated with a hollow laugh. "Right." He sipped the water, his hands trembling slightly. "You seem to know a lot about it." "I'm an astrophysicist," she said. It was the first time she'd said it since the event. The title felt absurdly grandiose now, like introducing herself as a wizard. Ewan just nodded, as if that explained everything. "So what do we do?" The "we" did not go unnoticed. Aris chose her words carefully. "For now, we stay put. Wait for this weather to clear. We're safe here. We have shelter, water, and a little food." She emphasized the little, setting a boundary early. She decided to start her data collection. "What did you see on your way here?" Ewan's face darkened. "Nothing. That was the worst of it. The silence. I was high up when it happened. Heard a sort of fizzing crackle in the air, then all the lights just went out. I saw a plane." He stopped, his eyes distant. "It was heading for Inverness. Its lights just vanished. Mid-air. I waited to hear an engine, a crash, nothing. Just gone." A cold knot tightened in Aris's stomach. The skies would have been full of aircraft, their systems obliterated. They wouldn't have just glided, they would have fallen from the sky. And then the lights started, Ewan continued, his voice barely a whisper. "It was beautiful. For a minute. Then it was biblical. I've never been so scared in my life. I just started walking. I walked all night in that storm. I thought I was dead." He was a data point. A single, terrified account that confirmed her worst-case models. The event had been global, instantaneous, and catastrophic. As Ewan talked, warming to the relief of human contact, Aris continued her assessment. He seemed genuine. His fear was raw and real. He was a liability in his current state, exhausted, unprepared, and psychologically shaken. But he was also strong, and he was another set of eyes and ears. He was a variable she had introduced into her experiment. The outcome was unknown. For now, the bothy felt less lonely, but it also felt infinitely more dangerous. She had traded the known quantity of solitude for the terrifying uncertainty of another human being. The quiet was gone, replaced by the soft crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of Ewan MacLeod's breathing. Chapter 5. The Weight of Another. The bothy, which had felt spacious in her solitude, now felt cramped. Ewan's presence was a physical thing, the sound of his breathing, the rustle of his synthetic jacket, the sheer bulk of him and his oversized pack taking up room. Aris found herself cataloguing his movements, her scientist's mind now tuned to a new field of study, human behavior under existential stress. He was eager to please, almost pathetically so. Once he'd warmed up and drunk his water, he insisted on taking over the duty of melting snow, meticulously refilling the pot each time it was half empty. I should pull my weight, he'd said, avoiding her eyes. Aris let him. It was a useful task that kept him occupied and conserved her gas canister. She used the time to study his gear as he unpacked it, a slow-motion train wreck of poor planning. He had a portable solar charger, useless. A drone with a camera, ludicrously useless. A large bag of trail mix, a block of cheese already sweating in its packaging, a half-eaten sausage, and a loaf of bread that was beginning to frost at the corners. His food was perishable, heavy, and inefficient. He had a cheap sleeping bag, more suited to a summer music festival than a Highland October, and a flimsy tent that looked like it would shred in a strong wind. But he also had gold. A full-sized, wicked-looking hunting knife in a leather sheath. A full 1-liter bottle of propane for a camp stove he didn't have with him. My mate was supposed to bring it, he explained sheepishly. And a large bag of dog food. Dog food. Aris couldn't help but ask. Ewan's face fell. For Bo. My border collie. I left her with my mum in Cairngorms. He looked suddenly like he might cry. Do you think, the cars, would they have just stopped? The question was like a punch to the gut. Aris had been thinking in abstracts, grids, systems, infrastructures. He was thinking of his mother and his dog in a car that became a metal coffin on a road full of them. Yes, she said softly, the truth feeling cruel but necessary. Lies were a currency that would devalue fast. Anything with a computer chip in the engine would have been fried. The roads will be impassable. Ewan nodded, swallowing hard, and turned back to arranging his things with a quiet, desperate intensity. Aris saw it then. His usefulness wasn't in his gear or his skills. It was in his knowledge. He was local. Ewan, she began, choosing her words carefully. You said you're from around here? I, Cairngorms. Lived there all my life. So you know this area? Not just the paths. The land. He looked up, a flicker of pride cutting through his despair. I do. My dad was a gamekeeper on the estate west of here. I spent most of my childhood in these glens. Aris unfolded her map, spreading it on the floor between them. Show me. It was like throwing a switch. Ewan's posture straightened. He leaned over the map, his finger, calloused and nicked with old cuts, stabbing down at points. Right. Okay. So we're here. This stream here, he pointed to a blue line on the map near Cora. It's good for brown trout, but no this time of year. Too high and fast. Further down, in the wider pools, maybe. His finger moved south. This area here, that's a big red deer carving ground. But the stags will be down lower now, in the sheltered corries. See this? He indicated a small, nameless crescent of contours. That's the wee cave. It's no on any guide. It's a tight squeeze, but it's dry and you'd never find it if you didn't know it was there. The data was invaluable. It transformed the two-dimensional map into a living, breathing landscape of opportunity and danger. He knew where the old, abandoned crofts were that might have forgotten apple trees or usable timber. He knew which hillsides were too exposed for shelter and which valleys were likely to have usable game trails. He was a repository of local knowledge she could never have acquired from a book or a map. But knowledge was only one part of the equation. Can you set a snare? She asked. The confidence on his face faltered. I've seen it done. A long time ago. My dad, he never really let me. Said it was messy. Can you fish? With a line, not a rod. I can do that, he said, more certainly. What about people? Aris asked, her voice dropping. The estates, the farms, the bothies. Who out here is friendly? Who's not? Who's likely to have a stockpile of food or fuel? Ewan's expression grew grim. He understood the subtext. Who will share, and who will shoot us on sight? The estate to the west, the one my dad worked, the owner is an absentee. A rich Londoner. The head gamekeeper, Donnell, he's a hard man. He'll have a locked gun cabinet and he'll not be shy about using it to protect the owner's property. His finger moved east. These farms here, along the Dee Valley. Good people. Old school. But they'll be scared. And they'll have families to feed first. He looked up at her, his earlier fear replaced by a dawning, grim understanding. It's no just about the cold and the hunger, is it? No, Ewan, Aris said, folding the map. It's not. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was a partnership, nascent and fragile, forged in the stark calculus of their new reality. He had the local knowledge, she had the survival skills and the strategic mind. Together, they were a more complete organism. But as they shared a meager dinner of his cheese and sausage and one of her dehydrated meals, Aris watched him. He was still a variable. His morale was a flickering candle. The memory of his mother and his dog was a shadow in his eyes. Despair was a luxury none of them could afford, and it could make him a liability as quickly as his knowledge made him an asset. She had gained a guide, but she had also taken on a weight. The weight of another human life, now tethered to her own. The quiet of the glens had been replaced by the low murmur of conversation, but the burden of leadership felt infinitely heavier than the silence. Chapter 6: The Calculus of Motion. 2 days. 48 hours of howling wind and relentless snow that sealed them inside the stone cocoon of the bothy. The world beyond the single window was a swirling, monochrome void. For Aris, it was a period of intense, forced adaptation. For Ewan, it was a slow, agonizing descent into a silent panic. He spent hours staring at the wall, his fingers tracing the grooves of old carvings. He jumped at the sound of a cracking peat brick in the fire. The uncertainty was eating him alive. Aris knew the signs. He was a system overheating, and without a purpose, he would crash. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. The wind died down to a whisper, and a weak, milky light filtered through the glass. The silence felt different, not the dead silence of the CME, but the bright, pregnant silence after a snowstorm. Aris was already packed. Her gear was organized, her decisions made. She had spent the storm days planning, her map covered in pencil notes gleaned from Ewan's knowledge. She'd also done maintenance, sharpening her knife, repairing a small tear in her pack, and most importantly, sorting the food. She'd combined their resources. His perishables were gone, consumed in the first 2 meals. What remained was her dehydrated food, his trail mix, and the grim, unspoken protein reserve of the bag of dog food. It sat in the corner, a symbol of how far their standards might yet fall. "We're leaving," she announced, her voice cutting through the stuffy air of the bothy. Ewan looked up from his staring contest with the floor, his eyes bleary. "Leaving? Going where? It's a meter of snow out there." "South. To Glen D," she said, tapping the map. "You said yourself, it's more sheltered. There's the river for fishing, and those old crofts might have resources we can scavenge. It's away from the main paths. Away from where everyone else will be thinking to go." "Everyone else?" he asked, his voice thin. "The ones from the towns," Aris said, her tone leaving no room for delusion. "When their food runs out, they'll come into the hills looking for help, for food, for anything. The main bothies on the popular trails will be the first places they hit. We don't want to be here when that happens." The logic was inescapable. Ewan nodded slowly, the reality of the situation finally overriding his paralysis. The need to do something was a powerful stimulant. "Right. Okay. Glen D." He began to shove his things haphazardly into his pack. "No," Aris said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We do this my way. We need to move fast and light. You're carrying too much useless weight." She walked over to his pack. He flinched slightly, a primal reaction to someone invading his resources, but didn't stop her. She appended it onto the sleeping platform. "What are you doing?" he asked, a note of protest in his voice. "An audit," she replied, her hands already moving. The drone was the first to go, placed unceremoniously in the corner of the bothy. The solar charger followed. "Dead weight." She held up his cheap, bulky sleeping bag. "This is a liability. It won't keep you alive in a cold snap." She tossed it aside. "That cost 50 quid, he protested. "And it's worth less than nothing now because it will get you killed and slow me down," she stated, the brutal truth hanging in the air. She kept his knife, the bottle of propane, his food, and his waterproofs. She came to a bulky, fleece-lined jacket. It was heavy and would be a sweatbox while hiking. We need to layer for movement, not bulk for static cold, she explained, holding it up. It was a teaching moment. She needed him to learn, not just obey. He looked like a scolded child, but he nodded. Okay. She repacked his bag with efficient precision, creating order from his chaos. The process was clinical, almost violent in its necessity. She was stripping away the vestiges of his old life, the comforting clutter of civilization, and forcing him to carry only what was essential for the bare act of survival. When she was done, his pack was half its original size and sat properly on his frame. Right, she said, handing it to him. Your job is navigation. You know this land. I'll follow. My job is pace and security. We move steady. We stop when I say. We listen. Always. He hefted the lighter pack, a look of surprise on his face. I can do that. They left the bothy without a backward glance. The world outside was dazzlingly bright and shockingly cold. The snow reached past their knees in places, and progress was a brutal, exhausting slog. Aris set a punishing but sustainable pace, her eyes constantly scanning the white expanse ahead, her ears straining for any sound other than their own labored breathing and the crunch of snow. Ewan, to his credit, was a natural navigator. He read the land beneath the snow, identifying subtle dips and rises that corresponded to the map in his mind. He led them on a route that avoided the deepest drifts, finding the path of least resistance through the frozen landscape. They walked for hours in silence, the effort too great for conversation. The Cairngorms were transformed into an Arctic wasteland, beautiful and utterly hostile. The only signs of life were the delicate tracks of a fox and once, the majestic, terrifying sight of a golden eagle circling high above, a dark speck against the pale blue sky, a reminder that the world was still alive, just changed. As the short day began to wane, Ewan pointed towards a cluster of skeletal birch trees clinging to the side of a hill. There, he said, his voice raspy from the cold air. The wee cave. Just past that copse. It wasn't a cave so much as a deep overhang in a granite outcrop, shielded from the prevailing wind by the trees. It was dry and, most importantly, hidden from the glen below. They shrugged off their packs, the relief immense. Aris's muscles screamed in protest. Without a word, they fell into a routine. Ewan gathered windfall wood from under the birch trees while Aris cleared a space for a small, concealed fire and got the stove going for water. As the tiny, hidden fire began to push back the creeping cold, Aris looked at Ewan. His face was flushed with exertion, but his eyes were clear. The hollow, terrified look was gone, replaced by a focused fatigue. He had done it. He had navigated them. He had pulled his weight. He had passed the first test. The variable was stabilizing. As they huddled under the granite shelf, eating a scant meal and watching their breath plume in the firelight, Aris allowed herself a sliver of something she hadn't felt since the lights went out, not quite hope, but the cautious satisfaction of a successful first step into the unknown. They were moving. They were adapting. They were still alive. Chapter 7. The First Law. The wee cave was a frigid, cramped haven, but a haven nonetheless. They slept in shifts, curled in their sleeping bags, the embers of their tiny fire a fragile defense against the deep cold of the night. Aris's sleep was thin and alert, every snap of a freezing twig or hoot of an owl jolting her back to consciousness. The weight of responsibility was a heavier blanket than any down filling. At first light, they were moving again, stiff-limbed and silent. The plan was to follow the high ground above Glen D, using the contours for cover until they could find a secure spot to descend toward the river. Ewan led with a new, quiet confidence. The success of the previous day had fortified him. He was in his element, reading the language of the land, the way the snow lay in drifts on the leeward side of heather clumps, the subtle animal trails that hinted at the easiest path. Aris followed, her world narrowed to the placement of her next footstep and the constant, 360-degree scan for threats. Not just from people, but from the environment itself. A twisted ankle here was a death sentence. It was Ewan who saw it first. He stopped so abruptly that Aris nearly walked into the back of him. He held up a closed fist, A signal she'd taught him for halt. He was staring down into the glen below, his body tense. "Smoke," he whispered, the word a pale ghost on the air. Aris's gaze followed his. There, perhaps a mile down the valley, a thin, grey plume rose from a cluster of Scots pines, weaving into the still morning air. It was too organized, too vertical to be a natural fire. It was a campfire. A jolt of adrenaline, sharp and cold, cleared the last of the sleep from her system. This was it. The variable they had discussed abstractly was now a tangible reality. "Down," she commanded, her voice low. They dropped to their bellies in the snow, the cold instantly seeping through their layers. Aris pulled the monocular from her survival kit, a simple, non-electronic optic that was now worth its weight in gold. She trained it on the source of the smoke. It took a moment to adjust, to pick out the details amidst the trees. Then she saw them. 3 figures. 2 men and a woman, hunched around a fire. Their clothes were a mismatch of urban wear and inadequate outdoor gear, denim jackets, trainers, a puffer jacket that was already soaked through. City people. Stranded. Their body language screamed exhaustion and despair. One of the men was gesturing wildly, arguing with the woman. Their voices were too far away to hear, but the tension was obvious even at a distance. Aris scanned the area around them. A few scattered backpacks, cheap and ill-suited for the conditions. No visible weapons. No organized campsite. They were just lost, and burning whatever they could find for warmth. She passed the monocular to Ewan. He took a long look, his face grim. "They're freezing," he murmured, a note of pity in his voice. "They'll no last the night out here." "I know," Aris said, her tone devoid of emotion. She was running calculations. Assets, 3 people. Unknown physical condition. High stress, low morale. Net drain on resources. Liabilities, 3 more mouths to feed. A source of conflict. Unpredictable. Probability of positive outcome was low. Risk to our survival was high. Ewan lowered the monocular. "We have to help them." Aris turned her head slowly to look at him. The cold of the snow was nothing compared to the chill in her voice. "How?" We can show them the bothy back there. Share some food. They're people, Aris." "And what happens when our food runs out twice as fast?" she asked, her voice quiet but intense. "What happens when one of them gets sick? Or decides our gear looks better than theirs? Or simply refuses to let us leave if we decide to? They are a complication we cannot afford." It was the first law of motion applied to survival. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. They had momentum, a plan, a direction. These people were a chaotic, unpredictable force that would stop them dead. Ewan stared at her, horror dawning on his face. He was seeing a different side of her, the part that could look at 3 freezing people and see only a negative equation. "We cannae just leave them to die. That's monstrous." "It's practical," Aris countered, her jaw tight. "Survival isn't about good and evil, Ewan. It's about calories and probability. Helping them lowers our probability of survival significantly." "My God," he breathed, scrambling back from her slightly as if she were contaminated. "You're actually serious." Below, the argument around the fire escalated. The gesturing man shoved the woman. She stumbled back, falling into the snow. The sound of her cry, thin and sharp, carried up the hill to them. Ewan made to stand up. "Right, that's it." Aris's hand shot out, gripping his arm with a strength that surprised them both. Her fingers were like ice vices. "No. You will stay down. They're attacking each other," he hissed, trying to pull away. "And if we go down there, they'll turn that aggression on us," she shot back, her eyes locking with his. "Look at them, Ewan. They are starving, freezing, and terrified. They are animals in a trap. You do not put your hand in the trap. We have 1 knife and 1 bottle of gas between us. What do you think is going to happen?" He was shaking, from cold and from rage. The humanity in him was at war with the new, brutal logic of their world. He looked from her implacable face down to the scene in the glen. The man who had done the shoving was now pacing, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of utter desperation. The woman was sobbing in the snow. "So what's your plan, then?" Ewan spat, his voice trembling. "We just watch. Wait for them to die." "My plan," Aris said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "is to not become them. My plan is for us to get to that river, to fish, to find shelter, and to live through the winter. They are not part of that plan. They are a threat to it." She held his gaze, and in that moment, the last vestiges of the old world fell away between them. It was no longer a debate. It was a choice. His morality against her mathematics. The sound of another shout echoed faintly from the glen. The choice had been made for them. The pacing man had grabbed one of the backpacks and was stomping away from the fire, heading north, back up the pass alone. The other man and the woman made no move to follow him. The group had shattered. Ewan slumped, the fight going out of him. He looked defeated. He had seen the future, and it was every man for himself. Aris released his arm. She felt no victory, only a cold, hollow certainty. She had preserved their momentum, but she had broken something in her only ally. The quiet of the Glens was back, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet of a grave, and she had just become one of its architects. Chapter 8. The Broken Equation. The silence between them was a wall. It was thicker and colder than the mountain air. Ewan walked several paces ahead, his shoulders hunched, his back a rigid statement of condemnation. He didn't look back, didn't check to see if she was following. He just moved, an automaton fueled by anger and a shattered conscience. Aris followed, her own mind a turmoil of cold logic and a strange, unfamiliar guilt that felt like a sickness. She had been right. The math was irrefutable. The survival of their two-person unit had to be the priority. Introducing 3 unstable, unprepared variables would have been suicide. So why did she feel like she'd failed a test she hadn't known she was taking? They made it to the River Dee by midday. It was a wide, rushing torrent of peat-stained water and slushy ice, its voice a constant roar that filled the glen. It was a source of life, and a formidable barrier. Ewan led them to a place he knew, a slightly calmer stretch where the water fanned out over a gravel bed, creating deeper, fish-holding pools. The practical need to work broke the silence, if not the tension. "We need to fish," Aris stated, her voice flat. It wasn't a suggestion. Ewan just grunted, shrugging off his pack. He took the fishing line and hooks from her kit with a curt, wordless efficiency that was somehow worse than an argument. He found a straightish stick for a rod, tied the line, and baited the hook with a shred of dried meat from his trail mix. He knew what he was doing. Aris left him to it. His focus was an asset. She needed to secure a more permanent shelter. The cave had been a one-night stop. Using Ewan's directions, she found the ruins of an old crofter's cottage 100 yards from the riverbank. Little more than a low, tumble-down wall and a partial stone chimney remained, but it was something. It broke the wind and offered concealment. She spent the next few hours gathering what dry wood she could find from under the snow-laden pines, building a small stone hearth within the shell of the chimney. It was methodical, physical work that allowed her mind to churn. She had treated Ewan like a variable, and he had reacted like a human being. She had optimized for survival and neglected the human factor. Morale was a resource as vital as food. A despondent partner was a liability. He could make a mistake, become careless, or simply stop cooperating. Her perfect equation was flawed because she had failed to account for the weight of a soul. The sound of a shout, this one triumphant, jolted her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Ewan standing by the riverbank, hauling something silver and thrashing from the water. A fish. A good-sized brown trout. By the time she reached him, he had it on the bank, dispatching it with a quick, practiced blow from the handle of his knife. He looked up at her, and for a fleeting second, the triumph in his eyes was pure, untainted by their earlier conflict. It was the look of a provider, of a man who could contribute. Then he remembered who he was looking at, and the shutters came down. The triumph faded, replaced by a guarded neutrality. "It's a good one," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It is," Aris agreed. She didn't offer praise. It would have sounded condescending. Instead, she gestured to the ruins. I found a spot. There's a windbreak and a place for a fire. It's better than the open. He nodded, gathering his line and the fish. Right. They prepared the fish in silence back at the ruins. Aris lit a small fire in the new hearth. The flames caught, curling around the skewered trout, filling the air with a smell that was so profoundly normal it was almost painful. It was the smell of 100 camping trips, of a world that no longer existed. As they shared the cooked fish, picking the delicate flesh from the bones with their fingers, the silence became less hostile. It was just silence, filled by the crackle of the fire and the rush of the river. Ewan spoke first, his eyes on the flames. He left her, you know. Aris stilled. What? The man down there. The one who shoved the woman. He took a pack and just walked off. Left the other two. He looked up, and his eyes were full of a deep, weary sorrow. You were right. They were breaking. But that doesn't make it right that we did nothing. Aris met his gaze. The guilt she'd felt earlier solidified into a cold, hard lump in her stomach. She had been right in her calculation, but he was right in his morality. And in this new world, which was more important? I wasn't trying to be cruel, Ewan, she said, and it was the closest to an apology she could muster. I was trying to keep us alive. The math doesn't care about right and wrong, he finished for her, his voice soft. I know. But we're not numbers, Aris. If we become like that, like him, just walking away, then what's the point of surviving at all? It was the fundamental question. Was the goal merely to persist, to breathe and consume for as long as possible? Or was it to preserve some shred of what made them human? She had no answer. Her science provided none. We can't save everyone, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We could have tried to save those three, he countered. We didn't even try. The truth of it hung between them. He had wanted to act on compassion. She had acted on cold logic. And in the void between those two impulses, 3 people had been left to their fate. Ewan wasn't a broken variable. He was a correcting one. He was the constant that reminded her that survival wasn't just a physical state. It was a moral one, too. The equation was broken. She needed a new one. One that factored in the weight of a shared fish, the value of a quiet conscience, and the cost of a soul left to die in the snow. The math was suddenly, terrifyingly, more complex than she had ever imagined. Chapter 9. The New Calculus. The fish, and the fragile truce it forged, lasted a day. The following morning, hunger returned, a sharp-toothed companion that gnawed at their resolve. The river, after its one generous gift, offered nothing but cold, rushing water. Ewan's fishing line remained taut and empty. The sight of the unopened bag of dog food in Ewan's pack became a constant, nagging presence. It was no longer a grim joke, it was a tangible asset. Calories. Protein. Survival. Ewan avoided looking at it. Aris found her eyes drawn to it, her scientist's mind dispassionately listing its nutritional components. It was designed to sustain life. That was its function. The packaging was irrelevant. On the second morning by the river, with a hard frost silvering the ground and their breath pluming thick in the air, Aris broached the subject. The dog food, she said, her voice carefully neutral. We need to consider it. Ewan, who was attempting to coax a few more flames from their meager fire, went very still. He didn't look up. No. Ewan, it's food. It's calories. We need fuel. It's for Bo, he said, his voice low and thick. It's not for us. Bo isn't here, Aris said, the words brutal and necessary. And if she was, you'd want her to survive, wouldn't you? You'd want her to eat, even if it wasn't her preferred brand. This is no different. It is different, he snapped, finally looking at her. His eyes were bright with a mixture of anger and pain. It's giving up. It's admitting that everything is truly gone. It's animal food. We are animals, Aris stated flatly. Right now, that's all we are. 2 warm-blooded organisms trying to maintain homeostasis. That bag represents a significant boost to our energy reserves. Sentiment is a luxury our bodies can't afford. He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. The gap between them, momentarily bridged by the shared trout, yawned wide open again. He saw a callous monster. She saw a man clinging to symbols from a dead world. "I will do it," he said, his jaw set in a stubborn line she hadn't seen before. It was the expression of a man defending a last, sacred bastion of his humanity. Aris felt a flash of frustration so hot it momentarily burned away the cold. They were arguing over processed kibble while starvation loomed. It was absurd. "Then you're choosing a symbol over our survival," she said, her voice cold. "And you're choosing to be a beast," he shot back. The words hung in the frozen air between them, stark and unforgiving. It was an impasse. She could not force him. To do so would destroy their partnership completely. But to let his sentiment dictate their caloric intake was a risk she couldn't accept. She had to adapt. The equation had to change. It couldn't just be her math against his morality. It had to be a new math, one that incorporated his values as a quantifiable variable. A new formula for a broken world. She took a deep breath, forcing the frustration down. "Okay," she said, her tone shifting from confrontational to analytical. "Okay. New plan." Ewan eyed her warily, expecting a trick. "The dog food is our absolute last resort," she conceded. "Our emergency reserve. We don't touch it until we are literally starving." "Agreed." He gave a slow, hesitant nod. "But that means we need to find other calories. Now. Today." She unfolded the map, spreading it on the frozen ground between them. "You said there were old crofts. Abandoned ones. The ones that haven't been renovated for holiday homes. What are the chances they might have old vegetable patches? Potato fields that have gone to seed? Apple trees?" Ewan's expression shifted from defiance to contemplation. He leaned over the map, his finger tracing the glen. Maybe. It's a long shot. The sheep and the deer will have taken most anything. But there's a place, a wee steadings called Obliterates. My dad said it was abandoned after the war. It's off the beaten path. Might be worth a look." It was a compromise. He was offering a solution that didn't violate his principles. He was engaging in the new calculus. "How far?" Aris asked. 3-4 miles. Up that side glen." He pointed to a narrow cleft in the hills to the west. "Then that's today's objective," Aris said, finality in her voice. "We move, we scavenge, we assess. We are proactive, not reactive." The mission gave them purpose. The tension eased, replaced by a focused urgency. They packed up their meager camp, the unopened bag of dog food going back into Ewan's pack, now reclassified from a point of conflict to a grim insurance policy. The hike to Obliterates was tough, a steep climb into a higher, bleaker valley. But they moved with a unified goal. Ewan was back in his role as navigator, his knowledge of the land their primary asset. Aris scanned for threats and conserved their energy, her mind no longer just calculating calories burned, but also the value of partnership maintained. They found the steadings just as the afternoon light began to fade. It was more complete than Aris had hoped, a low stone house with a collapsed roof, a stone barn that was mostly intact, and a field now overrun with bracken and thistle. The garden would have been out back, Ewan said, his voice hushed, as if speaking in a church. They picked through the frozen, snow-dusted earth behind the house, their hands numb with cold. Hope was fading fast. Then Ewan's boot kicked something hard. He knelt, brushing away the snow and dead vegetation. "Aris," he said, his voice tight with excitement. She was at his side in an instant. There, hidden by years of neglect, were the rotted remains of potato plants. But beneath the surface, his probing fingers found them, small, hard, frozen tubers. They were no bigger than golf balls, and many were spoiled, but a handful were firm. Wild potatoes. A forgotten harvest. It wasn't a feast. It was maybe a meal's worth of starchy, bitter food. But it was food they had found together. It was food that didn't have a picture of a Labrador on the bag. Ewan held up a muddy, frozen potato, a grin splitting his grimy face. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him since the lights went out. Aris felt an unexpected surge of triumph. They had not just found calories. They had found a third way. They had adapted. As they carefully dug up the meager harvest, she understood. The new calculus wasn't just about numbers. It was about balancing the cold, hard facts of survival against the warm, fragile flame of the human spirit. And for now, against all odds, the equation was in balance. Chapter 10: The Delicate Balance. The meager harvest of frozen potatoes was a sacrament. They boiled them in meltwater over their carefully tended fire in the stone barn, and ate them slowly, savoring every bland, starchy mouthful. It was the most satisfying meal Aris could remember. It wasn't just sustenance, it was vindication. A proof of concept for their fragile, new partnership. The following days fell into a harsh but sustainable rhythm. They became creatures of the glen. Ewan's fishing line yielded another 2 trout, and he taught Aris how to find freshwater mussels nestled in the muddy banks of the Dee, a risky but protein-rich supplement. Aris, in turn, systemized their existence. She created a hidden smoke hole in the barn's roof to vent their fire, devised an alarm system of balanced stones at the approaches to their ruin, and enforced a strict rationing schedule. The dog food remained in its bag, a silent monument to the line they had not yet crossed. But the world outside their small sanctuary was not static. The weather hardened, the clear days giving way to a bitter, consistent cold that sealed the land in ice. And one afternoon, a new sound echoed up the glen, the unmistakable, distant crack of a gunshot. It was a single, flat report that rolled between the hills like a thunderclap. It was far away, perhaps from the direction of the estate lands Ewan had warned her about. But its message was immediate and clear: the new world had weapons. And where there were weapons, there was violence. The sound changed everything. It made the walls of their stone barn feel paper-thin. Their careful routine now felt like a dance on a high wire. The calculus of survival had just introduced a terrifying new variable: armed conflict. It was this fear that sharpened the sight Aris saw 2 days later. She was on a high bluff, gathering frost-bleached kindling, when movement in the distant southern end of the glen caught her eye. She dropped, heart hammering, and fumbled for her monocular. A single figure. A man. Moving with a purposefulness that spoke of knowledge and intent. He wasn't stumbling lost like the city people. He was tracking. He stopped, examining the ground, then moved on, following the riverbank north. Towards them. He was too far away to make out details, but his posture, the way he carried a long object, a rifle, a staff, across his back, screamed of competence. A hunter. And they were in his territory. Aris scrambled down the bluff, her blood running colder than the ice underfoot. She found Ewan checking his fishing lines by the river. "Someone's coming," she breathed, pulling him into the cover of the pines. "A man. Heading this way. He looks like he knows what he's doing." All the color drained from Ewan's face. The memory of the gunshot was fresh in both their minds. "Donal," he whispered, the name of the gamekeeper a curse. "I don't know. But we can't be here." The decision was made in seconds. They had a bug-out plan for this exact scenario. In 5 frantic minutes, they erased all signs of their occupation. They doused the fire, scattered the ashes, bundled their gear, and used a branch to sweep away their footprints from the dusty floor of the barn. They left nothing but cold stones. Their retreat was to the wee cave, the hidden overhang higher up the valley side. They reached it as the short day began to fail, sweating despite the cold, their breath ragged. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of their former home. They didn't have to wait long. The man emerged from the tree line below. It was not Donal. This man was older, his movements economical and sure. He carried a shotgun, broken open over his arm. He stopped at the ruins of the croft, his head moving slowly as he took in the scene. He knelt, examining the ground where Aris had swept it. He placed a hand on the stone chimney of their hearth. He knew. He might not know who they were or how many, but he knew someone had been here, and recently. He stood for a long time, scanning the surrounding hillsides. Aris and Ewan pressed themselves against the cold rock, not daring to breathe. The man didn't call out. He didn't search further. After a few minutes, he did something unexpected. He took a small, cloth-wrapped parcel from his pocket and placed it carefully on a prominent stone in the crumbling wall. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, disappearing into the gathering twilight. They waited until full dark, the cold seeping into their bones, before they dared to move. Aris covered Ewan's descent with her trekking pole held like a weapon, her nerves screaming at every shadow. The parcel was still there. Ewan brought it back to the cave, his hands trembling. By the light of a single candle, they unwrapped it. Inside was a chunk of dense, dark oatcake and a single, spent brass shotgun shell. The message was as clear as it was ancient. The food was an offer. I know you are here. I am not your enemy. The spent shell was a warning, but I am armed. Do not threaten me. Ewan held the oatcake. It's old Mrs. Gow's, he said, his voice full of wonder. From the farm in the next valley. She makes it, made it, this way. With the barley flour. The world, which had seemed so vast and empty, suddenly felt very small. Their glen was not a vacuum. It was a neighborhood. And their neighbors were now making introductions. Aris looked from the humble offering to Ewan's awestruck face, then out into the vast, star-dusted darkness of the night. The calculus was more complex than ever. The variables were no longer just food, water, and shelter. They were community, trust, threat, and mercy. The quiet of the glens was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions and fragile, nascent connections. They were not just surviving. They were learning how to live in the silence. The balance was delicate, terrifying, and alive. Their isolation was over. A new chapter was beginning. This was The Quiet of the Glens, written by Beryl Coops.
I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.